Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it all comes down to.
Now, we Baptists cherish our doctrinal inheritance. I want to say this without stutter. We are a people of the book.
Payday someday had become a reality in Jezebel's life.
My brother, if the hierarchical approach to the scriptures dominates our institutions and our denomination, there will be no missionaries to hurt. They will cease to exist.
I have no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me.
How do 85 graves go missing? It's probably a question you thought you'd never be asked, but in today's episode of the Baptist Directory, we're going to be looking at the sudden and outlandish disappearance of 85 graves from what was historically known as the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery of Russellville, Kentucky. Now, just a little behind-the-scenes note here. Every episode of the Baptist Directory is manuscripted. I write down everything I'm going to say. In some of the older episodes where there was no video of me, I literally sat and read the manuscript. This episode is manuscripted as well, and you might see me peeking down at my notes here to make sure that I'm getting the details right, because this is something that's somewhat ongoing. Some of the individuals that we're going to talk about today are still alive. Many of them are not. By far, most of them are not. But there are certain individuals named in this story that are still alive. Certainly the churches that are involved are still active. And so I want to make sure that I get the information correct on this, because I don't want to misrepresent anybody. As we discuss the disappearance of 85 graves from the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery in Russellville, Kentucky. Well, I'm sitting here today right outside of my church at Antioch, and in the background you can see the old Antioch Baptist Cemetery. This church was founded in 1818, moved to this site in 1859 and erected this church. And the cemetery here behind me is the original Baptist cemetery. Many of the people buried there have been there since about that time, 1859 or forward. And I'm very proud of the way that this church has taken care of the original cemetery. The story today is of a church that somewhat forgot that it had one. And the story begins on March the 25th of 1833, when a group of individuals representing the First Baptist Church of Russellville, Kentucky, were deeded a property. It was 1.113 acres on the north side of the city of Russellville that they were deeded for the purposes of using it as a burial ground. The original owners were a couple named Elias and Elizabeth Betty, and they transferred the property to the trustees of the First Baptist Church of Russellville, in their words, to be perpetually cared for and utilized by the congregation. Note those words, to be perpetually cared for and utilized by the congregation. The original trustees were people that really mattered. A guy named John Breathitt, who would go on to become one of the governors of Kentucky, was an original trustee. William Warder, who was at that time the pastor of the church, we'll talk about him quite a bit. William McPike, Colonel Samuel Poindexter, who served in the War of 1812, John Penix, and Albert G. Ray, who was at that time a member of the Kentucky State Congress and would go on to have his son run for governor one day. This was not a ragtag group of people. These were people who very much mattered in the city of Russellville. It was thought that, and it still is thought, that this might have been the original site of the First Baptist Church of Russellville before they moved it a little closer into town to be a little bit more central. But there's clear evidence that there were some individuals who were already buried at that plot before the church took official legal ownership of it. One guy named Spencer Curd was buried there. He was one of the founders of the city of Russellville. He was one of the founding members of the First Baptist Church. And Sarah Grubbs was also already buried there. Her family also, the Grubbs family, were prominent members who helped found the city of Russellville, and she was also one of the founding members of First Baptist Church there. At the time, the pastor of First Baptist Russellville, I already mentioned a guy named William Warder, who was born in 1786 in Virginia. He was a rather important figure in Baptist life all on his own. He had come to Kentucky, which at that time, you got to bear in mind, was part of the western frontier of the United States. Kentucky had only been a state for about 30 years at this time, so it's still very much the West. We have not purchased the Louisiana Purchase. Kentucky is pretty far west, and it's still very much a wilderness out here. There are not a lot of Baptists. Baptists are more or less a new tribe of people in this region. And so Pastor Warder was kind of a forerunner in a lot of ways. His family was known for being on the edge of civilization, as it were, in the United States. He was one of the 2 representatives of Kentucky at the 1817 Triennial Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Again, that's one of the forerunners of both the Southern and Northern Baptist conventions. And so William Warder was a rather important person. And he wasn't just the pastor of First Baptist Church of Russellville. He was also the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Bowling Green. His wife, Margaret, was the sister of a guy named Charles Moorhead, who would also become one of the governors of the state of Kentucky and was at that time a representative in the House of Representatives for the Commonwealth. And so this guy was well connected. He was very important. And only 3 years after procuring the plot of ground for the cemetery, he would be laid to rest there. He died at the age of 50. And his headstone read, "Before God, he worked humbly, before man, uprightly." And so in a very short time, there were many other influential members of society who would be laid to rest there beside him. One example is a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a guy named Joshua Cates, who was interred there in 1840. Colonel Samuel Poindexter, who served in the War of 1812, as I previously mentioned, would be buried there in 1875. And his son Henry, who was a veteran of the Civil War, would be buried there in 1868. Similarly, there were family members of important families who would be buried there. Nimrod Long, who owned the Long Banking Company in Russellville. He was the one who was robbed by Jesse James. He was actually shot in the head, but survived it by Jesse James. He would bury his 2-year-old daughter there, as well as 2 of his wives. He was thrice widowed. And so this cemetery was a rather important cemetery. A lot of prestigious people there. A lot of the founding members of the city of Russellville were buried there. A lot of the founding members of First Baptist Church were buried there. So, again, the question that we're discussing is, how do you lose 85 graves? Well, over time, the property on which this 1.113 acre cemetery was found became more and more industrially connected than culturally connected. As the city moved, the First Baptist Church moved closer into the center of town, and the area in which this cemetery was located became adjacent to the main railroad that ran through town. And that railroad was used not just for travel, but also for industrial shipping. And that actually became the primary use of it in the days in which traveling by train ceased. And so it became a part of the property that was leased by a factory called BTR. BTR leased this property from the First Baptist Church. First Baptist retained ownership of it, but leased it to them for their usage. It was a die casting factory. And so apparently, when the church was leasing out this neighboring plot to major factories in the early 1900s, they simultaneously began burying their esteemed dead in the Maple Grove Cemetery of Russellville, which became the premier and prestigious cemetery of the town. If you go there today, governors are buried there. Governor Breathitt's buried there. W.W. Warden, or rather W.W. Gracious, can't remember his name. Barnes. W.W. Barnes. Who was one of the early pastors of First Baptist, who was the president of the Home Mission Board. He's buried there. Nimrod Long is buried there. And so as decades passed, Maple Grove Cemetery became the cemetery that everybody used. And the factory landscapers at BTR, who were caring for the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery on the outskirts of town, continued to tend to the greenery that remained around that plot, but they started taking less and less care of the cemetery itself because they believed that it was the responsibility of the church to take care of the graves themselves. And so they would make sure that there was an easement to the cemetery so that people who wanted to visit could get there. That was part of their original lease agreement. But they did not take care of the cemetery itself, hedging and everything and going amidst the graves, landscaping in that manner. They didn't do that. It appears that the church expected or maybe assumed that the factory would tend to the cemetery, and so for several decades, they neglected to do so. And that continued until at some point in the early 1980s, which was over 70 years after the last person had been laid to rest in that cemetery, BTR began pressuring the church to tend and take up the maintenance of their own cemetery. They said that it was becoming an eyesore in the front of their business. And it's true. I've got images that those of you who are watching on YouTube will be able to see. The cemetery had been poorly kept. It was in a state of utter disrepair. Certainly, it was not the kind of thing that a successful business would want out in front of their factory. Many of the headstones had been overturned. Some of them had been overturned because moles and groundhogs had dug out the foundational footing of them. Others of them had been overturned because trees had fallen on top of them. Others of them had been overturned because of what was expected to be vandalism. And so some of them were broken, of course, but many of them were still upstanding. Although maybe several of them were in need of leveling. A great number of them could have been erected right where they lay. You can look at the photographs that we have and you can tell it's a mess, but it's rectifiable. And so that was the status of the cemetery in the early 1980s when BTR began pressing for the church to take up the maintenance of the graves themselves. When they began pressuring First Baptist Church to care for its cemetery, at that point, there was a gentleman by the name of J.R. Samsom who enters the story. Samsom was a deacon at First Baptist. More importantly, he seems to have been the head of their cemetery committee. Now, mind you, if there was such a committee that already existed at First Baptist, a cemetery committee, it would have been for no other purpose than to maintain that cemetery, because First Baptist had no other cemetery. So the sheer existence of a cemetery committee should have indicated to them, had they forgotten that they had the cemetery, that they had one. J.R. Samsom in 1984 goes to the cemetery and he begins trying to care for it, evidently on his own. And his idea of caring for it was to simply go through the entire cemetery spraying pesticide so as to kill all of the greenery and plant life in the cemetery. He evidently, by his own testimony, did this for 2 summers, at the end of which he concluded, and these are his words, that 90% of the original markers are broken, strewn, or illegible, rendering the cemetery inaccessible and precluding traditional maintenance. End quote. So, as a result, J.R. contacted the Kemp Ceiling Stripping and Patchwork Company, and he gave them $1,000 even to refurbish the grounds of the cemetery. That was in February 1987. Okay? It must be noted this was paid in full before he ever got permission from the church to do so. The full minutes of the First Baptist Church are now found at the Logan County Public Library. You can go and read them as I did, and you can find that they do not make any mention whatsoever of the cemetery in the months leading up to or through the vast majority of this process. So he did pay $1,000 to this company to do a restoration project, refurbishing, I believe is the word that they used, on the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery, what they usually just call the Old Baptist Cemetery. It was only after that was done, on April the 8th, 1987, so a full, 3 months? February, March, April. So beginning of February, he pays for this. Middle of April, he brings a motion before the church to, quote, clean up the cemetery at an expense of up to $1,000. And so seemingly this is kind of an approval in retrograde. He's getting reimbursed for what he's already paid. He didn't give them any details at that time about what this cleaning up would constitute, but it is nevertheless inarguable that by the end of February 1987, this work was already done. We know that because another individual at the church, a woman named Polly Samsom, began writing to friends in Virginia who had family buried in the cemetery, telling them about how they should be glad to know that the church had recently cleaned up the cemetery where their families were buried. And these individuals responded just joyously, thanking them for doing this. The church wrote a brief historical book recording that 1984 was the year in which they began the cleaning of what they called a neglected old Baptist church cemetery located on the Rockwell manufacturing site. That's the BTR site. And so they acknowledge that this started in 1984. We know that the first step toward actually cleaning everything, aside from the spraying of it with pesticides, took place in February 1987. But what they really didn't understand was what that cleaning up was. So there are photographs that were taken by the crew that was working the project at the Kemp Company, where they show very clearly what the process was that they were hired to do. The very first thing that they did, now mind you, the very first thing that they did was remove all of the headstones. That was the first thing they did. Remove every headstone from the ground. After they had done that, they cleared all the underbrush. They removed every remaining stone, every one that didn't have writing on it, every one that did have writing on it. They removed every stone. Then they cut down every single tree in the area, and I mean all of them. Little saplings, huge oaks, everything. They cut down every single tree in the area, large and small, at which point they gathered all the smaller trees and all the branches and burned them in these huge bonfires that you can see in the photographs. They left mostly just rather large logs and massive tree stumps for a season as everything kind of dried out and remained from the burnings. After everything had kind of settled, they brought in bulldozers to remove all of the remaining large objects like the tree stumps and the roots and the remaining rocks in the ground, and they left the site leveled for several days before they brought in fill dirt to make the site truly flat and plumb. And that was left for a while before they came back a third time to strew some straw all over the ground and seed new grass. Okay, so step one was removing every tombstone from the graveyard. Step two was to level the place, cut down every tree, burn everything, remove every rock, remove every stump. And step three was to come in and straw it so that you can seed grass. At the end, if you were looking at where the cemetery was, you would never have ever known that a cemetery had ever been there. There were absolutely no markings as to where any of the graves had ever been. And importantly, it should be remembered, they did not disinter any of the people who were buried there. They left everyone in all 85 graves buried there with no headstones, unmarked and covered so as to create a flat plain. Ray Charles could have recognized that this was legally questionable. He could have seen that, okay? Within a year, J.R., the deacon who had reached out to start this whole process, contacted a woman by the name of June Line. That's spelled L-I-G-N-E. I'm assuming that it's pronounced Line. She was a retired judge connected with the church, and so J.R. asks her for some legal counsel to make sure that he's not going to be in danger of any sort of legal consequences of having done this. Surely he knew immediately this is not a good look. In March of 1988, mind you, a full year after the project had been carried out, June received word from Frederick J. Cohen, who was at that time the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. She had reached out and asked him about this, and he advised them that their, quote, plan to remove crumbling grave markers would not seem to be strictly in conflict with any state law, so long as two things were done. Okay? Number one, the church would need to, quote, contact survivors of the persons buried there and advise them of the church's plan. If any survivors object to the plan, they can discuss these objections with the church. That was number one. First, you've got to contact the surviving family members of the people buried there and ask for their insights before you begin a project like this. Secondly, efforts should be taken to find, quote, markers which are beyond repair, remove them, and replace them so as to not violate the statute which prohibits the desecration of graves. Now, obviously, there are a couple of problems here. First of all, the project was already done. Okay, it was a bit late to ask for legal counsel as to how to carry this out properly, because the project was already done. The inquiry had been sent a full year after the project was completed. There was no possibility of contacting the surviving families to ask for their input. That's not to say that no families remained, because remember, a full year prior, Mrs. Sansom had reached out to the families of people who were buried there to tell them that the project was already completed. Okay, so we know there were families that were known of, and we also know the project was already done. The second problem is related to removing and replacing the markers that were beyond repair so as to not violate the statutes against desecrating the graves. J.R. testified in writing multiple times that the stones were in such a state of disrepair and in such an unmanaged position that, in his words, quote, "It was impossible to determine the location of the graves or make any type of accurate determination concerning the original burial plots." So in his mind, there was no way to know who was buried where, and, importantly, there was no accurate map of the graves that had ever been or could ever be made, because to replace the stones on an individual basis was impossible because they were no longer in the places in which they should have been to begin with. So in J.R.'s mind, the graves were not where they should have been. There was no way of making an accurate map. You couldn't possibly replace them all because they weren't where they belonged in the first place. So, number one, they couldn't contact the families to ask for advice because the project was already done. Number two, they couldn't simply replace the stones that needed to be replaced because they didn't know where any of them went, and there was no map. This is almost a moot point because, as we've already mentioned, all of the headstones were already removed. All of them. It would have been one thing to say the crumbling headstones or the ones that are strewn about can't possibly be replaced because we don't know where they belong. At this point, he can't replace any of them because they've all been removed. So, J.R., nevertheless, following his legal counsel, does attempt to follow the advice of the Attorney General. Now you might ask, how could he do that? The work was already done. Yes, but J.R. saw to it that a small public notice was printed in the local newspaper 4 times between November the 10th and November the 24th of 1988. And in this printing ad, they advertised that the public would have the opportunity to attend a meeting at the First Baptist Church on November 29th at 7 o'clock at night to discuss the, quote, cleaning and renovation of the old Baptist ground for the purpose of, quote, preserving and better identifying those graves and markers of the people buried in the said cemetery. Okay, so they advertised to the public a year and a half later that they want people to come and give some insights about a project they're proposing to clean and renovate this graveyard for the purpose of preserving and better identifying the graves and the markers of the people buried there. Mind you, this is already done. They've removed all of it. At that meeting, they said people would have the opportunity to offer any input they might have and to hear the plans that the church has for the renovation. It's a risky plan. You can tell why they would make it such a small ad and only print it 4 times. But at that point, they were very fortunate that nobody seems to have noticed the ad because, as Polly Sansom would later testify under oath, not a single person showed up for the meeting. So following the meeting, which no one attended, somehow in December of 1988, a full 2 years after this project had been completely completed, J.R. and a fellow deacon, a guy named Ira Johnson, produce a map showing the placement of every person buried in the cemetery and where they had been originally interred. December 1988. Now again, the graveyard was entirely cleared and leveled in February of 1987. So we're quite near 2 years removed from every single grave being completely flattened. And at this point, for the first time ever, a brand new map having no previous predecessors is produced, showing the placement of every grave and everyone in it. One could convincingly speculate this map was entirely false. It's really curious as to where it would have come from, because J.R. himself had previously maintained that this was impossible to do, that you could not ever have found out where everyone was buried, and that no accurate list of such original burials existed before he began the process. Where'd this map come from? Nobody knows. The final step to following the Attorney General's instructions was taken on the 6th of April, 1989, when a replacement stone was ordered from the Keith Monument Company in Russellville. The names to be written on the stone were to be provided by the church, and this single stone would have the names of every single person buried in the cemetery. Notably, it would include nothing about their lives. Their epitaph would not be included, when they were married, who they were married to, who their children were, what they accomplished in their lives, what wars they served in, or how they were known to the community would not be included as it had been on their original gravestones. All that would be printed on this single stone would be their name, their birth date, and their death date. Later that same month, April 1989, quite curiously, J.R. and Polly Sansom both went to the police station and made an official statement on the record, recording under oath that they had only done what the church told them to do. Odd. That doesn't scream innocence to me. Now, on the 21st of June, 1989, just a couple of months later, a lawyer in Russellville by the name of Joe Grand Clark, who himself is an active part of the historical preservation of the city, wrote a letter to J.R. Sansom asking about this project. Mr. Clark, the attorney, had been asked to inquire about the church's actions by the Russellville City Council, and he said that they had concerns that the gravestones had been desecrated. I wonder why they thought that. Sansom indicated that Mr. Clark could contact his attorney, and that any personal interaction between him and the city council would be done by way of his personal friend, a man that he simply names as Councilman Simmons, who, by the way, seems to have been a personal friend of his, who he says, quote, supported the plan. Mr. Clark did reach out to J.R.'s lawyer, a guy named Mr. Fred Green, and on the 11th of July, the following day after Mr. Clark reached out, Mr. Green responded, and he said two things. Number one, Mr. Green says, it is the opinion of J.R. Sansom that, quote, this is an issue entirely within the province of the church, and that city government should have no jurisdiction in this area. So his first response is, this is the church's responsibility. The city government has absolutely no jurisdiction to tell us what to do with our own cemetery. Secondly, he says that there has been no desecration that's taken place, but rather the stones had been removed and, catch these words, gathered and placed in the cemetery, arranged in a manner which would best display the said tombstones. You'll want to remember that line for later. It was on the 31st of July, 1989, that the first notice of public awareness of the renovation arrived. Her name was Julia Neal. She was a reputed historian from the Bowling Green area whose work has been immortalized through a library being renamed after her in Auburn, Kentucky. She had spoken with a man named Dr. Jerry Martin. Dr. Martin had actually come to the cemetery and noticed that an odd experience had taken place in which he had found the cemetery missing. He had subsequently reached out to her as a member of the History and Archives Committee at the First Baptist Church of Bowling Green, where he was a member, to express concern about the disappearance of the monument of Reverend William Warder, who she notes was the first pastor of their church, as well as an early pastor of the church in Russellville. She details in the letter that this discovery of the disappearance was made by another member of the committee who had stopped by, and that this well-respected physician, Dr. Martin in Bowling Green, had noted that he had been to the cemetery only a few years prior, probably back when J.R. was spraying the greenery down, and that he had found everything that he needed without much difficulty, in his own words. He had now returned in 1989 to take some photographs of William Warder's grave, only to find absolutely nothing there. "Has this stone been stored somewhere else?" she asked, "or has it been destroyed?" Now, Julia's letter was markedly more polite and more restrained than what was to follow. She wrote that letter on the 31st of July, 1989. She wrote another letter that day to her friend, Dr. Jerry Martin, telling him what she had recently learned about the cemetery. She had had some initial conversations with him about it after he noticed that it was missing, but evidently her following conversations with other people in the Russellville area had not encouraged him. You see, the following month, the 18th of August, 1989, Dr. Martin wrote to the new pastor at First Baptist Church, a guy named Dr. Don Zuberer, who, by the way, had only been voted in 1988. He probably had no idea what was going on. Dr. Martin asks him some very pointed questions. I'm going to read the great majority of his letter to the pastor of First Baptist Church. Dr. Martin said, "I am hopeful that the remains of all those early pioneers were exhumed and relocated in another cemetery. If so, where?" The answer: they hadn't been. "Have the tombstones been relocated? And if not, when will the new graves be appropriately marked?" he asked. The answer: they had not been relocated properly, and they would not be appropriately marked. He goes on, "I trust that the same original tombstones will be used for that purpose." Incorrect. He continues, "Who authorized the exhumation and relocation?" The answer: nobody. "Who has the deed to the new burial plots? Who now owns the land that was the site of the Pioneer Cemetery?" That was all still First Baptist. "Which governmental agency was notified, and who were the individuals involved in the negotiations?" The answer: nobody. "Was this done clandestinely and surreptitiously?" The answer: yes. "If the remains were not moved to a new location, and if the original stones are to be relocated in their original positions after the grading, clearing, and etc. is completed, how were the graves marked to prevent errors and confusion in replacement of the stones? I saw no evidence of any type of temporary markers." He saw none because there were none. "I hope that my belief that the cemetery has been destroyed is false and that my suspicions are totally unfounded." They weren't. "If indeed my suspicions are true, then Kentucky statutes have been violated." He concluded the letter by saying, "I am afraid that in this situation there has been a willful, planned, and total destruction of a cemetery. Apparently, a part of our Baptist heritage has been destroyed, a portion of our early Kentucky history has been erased, and the graves of one of our former governor's family has been desecrated. I am also incensed at the insensitivity of the culprit responsible for this travesty perpetrated against all decent-minded people." Dr. Martin also took to immediately writing to local newspapers and senators like a man named Nick Kafagoulis, one way or another. He asked them for an investigation to be done into this, as well as historical societies like the Kentucky Historical Society, the Kentucky Baptist Historical Society, and the Filson Club, which responded by calling this a serious crime. It appears that Dr. Martin's letter to the First Baptist Church of Russellville was immediately forwarded to their attorney, Fred Green, who responded to him, sending carbon copies of his response to every newspaper, every senator, and every historical society that Dr. Martin had contacted. He said that the cemetery committee had spent many hours arriving at a decision as to how best improve and maintain the cemetery, but they would welcome Dr. Martin's advice and assistance moving forward. At the same time, In late July through late August 1989, J.R. Sansom was scrambling to make sure that his legal P's and Q's had been put in order. He probably, and rightfully, assumed that there was an impending lawsuit for what he had done. And so he undertook the process of applying for the cemetery itself to be registered under the church's nonprofit status, which consequently exempted it from compliance with Kentucky state funeral and cemetery laws. That was approved on August 22, 1989 by the Attorney General. In October of 1989, the Attorney General's office wrote to Joe Clark, that's the attorney who was representing the city of Russellville, who was still inquiring about the legality of what First Baptist had done. Attorney General Cohen referenced the previous letter that he had written a year or more prior to June line, recommending that in order to do this legally, the surviving families would need to be contacted and the stones removed would need to be replaced with a new marker. He referenced the newspaper article that they had posted about the public meeting that was to be held at First Baptist, and he referenced that there was a new marker that was going to be placed, and he said that because of these efforts, I can find no specific statute that has been violated, and as a situation has been presented to this office, we find no justification for action by the Attorney General. Now, of course, General Cohen had no knowledge of the fact that the work on the cemetery had been entirely completed prior to the church's following his legal advice, but nevertheless, based on the information that he had, he could find no reason for bringing legal action against the people who had done this, primarily J.R. Sansom. The Attorney General's conclusion seems to have concluded the process of rectification in the minds of Julia and Dr. Martin. They just had no legal recourse at that point. So the only remaining course of action that they saw that they could possibly take was to continue pursuing the return of the original stone of their pastor, William Warder. So they continued to ask for his stone. The church again claimed that all of the stones had been returned to the cemetery, remember these words, in a manner which would best display the said tombstones. Now, no one could find these tombstones that were said to be best displayed or stored there. So Julia kept making inquiries, and this is evidently what so enraged Dr. Martin. She heard two rumors that she told Dr. Martin about what had been done with these stones. The first she was told of by a man named Don Neagle, who was a local legend in the radio business in Russellville. He told Julia that the stones had been placed in a nearby barn. Okay, at least they'd be out of the weather in that case. Another person, though, Miss Rena Milliken, who was a faculty member at Union College and a very respected businesswoman in Russellville, had told Julia that she had been informed that the stones had been destroyed. In the days that followed, Dr. Martin would report that he had gone searching for the place where the church had supposedly returned the original stones to the cemetery. In some publications, J.R. Sansom had claimed that they put them in storage, that they had stored them at the cemetery in the northeast corner. Others had said that they were displayed, that they were best displayed in a way that had returned them to their original status there at the cemetery. Combining these ideas, Dr. Martin imagined that they must be kept in some sort of a structure, perhaps a former barn, as Julia had heard, on the northeast corner of the property. And so he goes looking for them. And in fact, he discovered that there was no such protective structure, but rather they were, quote, scattered on the ground. Without any legal recourse, he said in an interview that was conducted in 2025, "It's just not any of my business." The First Baptist Church of Russellville has renewed the cemetery's exemption status in 1995 and 2001, securing that they will remain in no danger of violating Kentucky state funeral and cemetery laws. Now, what does that bring us to today? Well, a visitor to the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery in Russellville, Kentucky will approach this new obelisk by walking roughly 100 yards across open grass. In the early plans for the restoration of the cemetery by J.R. Sansom, there were trees that had been planted intentionally for the purpose of beautifying the cemetery. All of those trees have been removed. None of them survived to this point. Assumedly, they also caused too much need for maintenance, and so they were subsequently cut down. From the road, a passerby might even notice the stone, which has the names of the 85 people buried there. They might think that it's a dedicatory marker to some sort of a railroad disaster that took place nearby, or a factory explosion that took place in the factory behind it. They would likely be entirely unaware that scattered all around and beneath this stone, through several feet of soil, both old and new, lie the bodies of many of Russellville's founders, senators, representatives, veterans of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, family members of governors, and the children of many of the common people who made up Russellville when they expected that this cemetery would be perpetually cared for when they were buried there. Approaching the stone, a person today might take notice of two important things. Just behind and to the left of the stone, when facing away from the road, there's a little path cut into the trees. It isn't obvious. You can see it if you're looking for it, but you wouldn't notice it otherwise. If you go down that path, you'll probably find some signs of homeless individuals who make their camp there. But if you press on through the rusty fence line of the factory, there's a conspicuous rise to the ground that's not covered in grass, but is covered in ivy and other vines. If you were to look really hard into these ivy and vines, you might notice a collection of very large, haphazardly deposited stones. These are the stones of the founders of the city of Russellville. These are the stones of the founders of First Baptist Church. These are the stones of the ancestors of the people who live all around this cemetery today. These are stones that were said to have been, quote, stored in such a way as to best display them. It turns out Dr. Martin was right. Rather than being stored in a barn somewhere, or stored in such a way as to best display them, they were just thrown into the woods and scattered on the ground. The second thing that a more keen observer might notice, if they take the time to compare the new stone that's there with the images from the renovation, is that the pedestal on which the new stone sits features in a few of the images from the renovation project. In several of the photos, this pedestal can be seen sitting solitary, even when all the other stones had been removed. In one photo, this pedestal can be seen sitting next to a few other overturned stones, at least one of which appears to have been the original stone which sat atop it. So it appears that, regrettably, the pedestal that sits under the new stone was once the gravestone of someone else. The person whose stone this was, of course, has had their identity lost to time, and their monument has been recycled and repurposed as the lone marker standing at the Pioneer Baptist Cemetery in Russellville. That is how 85 graves go missing. Thanks for listening to the Baptist Directory. If you're someone who listens to this as a podcast, take the time to look it up on YouTube. I think you'll enjoy the videos that are there. And if you're someone who's only ever watched our videos on YouTube and you find it hard to sit and watch them, as they can last sometimes up to an hour or more, go find it on your favorite podcast platform. It should be available. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.